Now let's go and call this function. So here you can see the new tuple is get created inside the memory, which contains 10, 20, 30, 40 and 50. And we are just going to iterate through this tuple one by one, and we will print all the values, right? So here you can see all the values get printed. Hello everyone, welcome back to another video. So in this video we are going to discuss functions basics, and we will also talk about types of function arguments, right? So these are the topics which we are going to cover today. Now let's first understand what is function. If you are coming from some another programming languages, you might be aware of functions, how it works. So the basic concept of the function would be the same in Python. What is function? So function is a group of statements that perform a specific task. And function is also useful to break our program into smaller and modular chunks. So that was a function definition. I know that is a bit theory part, but now onwards we are just going to see the coding part, right? So now let's see how we define a function in Python and how we can call it, right? So suppose I'm creating a function. So there is a keyword called a def, right? So def is used to define a function. So first we'll provide a def keyword and we'll provide the function name. So in this case I'm providing func. This is my function name, and within these brackets we will provide the arguments. If there is any arguments required for the function, we will provide here, and after that we'll provide a colon sign. So this colon sign will indicate Python interpreter. So now there is going to be block of statements. Now if we just simply go and print a message, right? Now let's see how to call this function. So to calling this function, it's very simple. You just need to provide the function name and the brackets. So in this way you can call the function. If you go and run this code, you will see we are getting my func printed. So this is the basics of function, how we define it and how we are calling it. Now let's go and define a new function which greet the people. So here I'm just going to define def greet, and in function argument I will provide the name of the person, right? And here I'm going to provide hello name. Now let's go and call this function greet and provide a name, for example John. If we go and run this code, you will see we are getting a greeting message. Now let's go and talk about the docket string. So basically it is used to explain in brief what this particular function does. So the docket string is pretty much handy for explaining what your function does. So once we define a function, right? So the first thing we do with function is we define a docket string, right? And we define a docket string inside 3 string quotations, right? Inside this quotation we provide any information that will be considered as a docket string. So we'll basically provide some brief information about the function. So there is a dunder method which we use to get the docket string of any function. Let me just show you. So if I just print greet.dunder.doc, if I go and print this, just observe, we are getting greet function greets new user. So whatever the information we have provided here, it will go and print that information. For example, we have a function called max, right? So we have a max function, and that is a built-in function, right? So if we go and run this code, you will get all the information, and this is totally optional, right? It is not required you have to use the doc function, but it is the best practice to follow this approach because this practice is actually used in software development cycles. So this is about the docket string. Now let's go and talk about the return statements. Let me just clear this code. Okay, so in this function what we are doing, we are just calling that function and printing a message, right? So suppose I don't want to print that message, I want the value to be returned. In this case, what we can do, we can use the return keyword. Okay, so there is an indentation error. So that code is get fixed. I will just go ahead and print a simple message. Greet from function. If we go and run this code, you will see we are getting greet from func. So this statement get printed, and now we are getting hello John. So we are getting the string back. right? So now observe one thing. If I don't write a return keyword, I will just go and simply print these information as we were doing initially. We are getting these outputs. Now if we go and run this code again, you will see we are getting greet from func, hello John, and now we are getting a none. So basically, if we don't return anything from a function, function will return a none as a default value. Now let's go and talk about function arguments in Python, right? So basically there are 4 types of arguments which we can provide to the function. Okay, so here is our small function which we have written, right? So we have defined a function called show data, and here we are expecting 2 arguments. So the first arguments which we are going to talk about, that is a default arguments. So suppose if I want to define a default value for this parameter, so I will use the equal sign which is used to define a default value, right? And here I will provide any default value. So let me just go and print some of that examples. Okay, so here we are just calling this function with a 1 value. We have just provided a single argument while calling this function. Now let's quickly go and run this code, and you will see we are getting employee name as a CV and the employee role as a dev. So we have not provided the second argument. So in this case, it will go and consider this default value. Now if I'm calling this function, what we are doing here, we are just calling this function with 2 arguments. This first argument will get assigned to the first variable, and the second argument will get assigned to the second variable, right? So in this time, this function will not consider this default value because we are providing that value while calling this function. So if we go and run this, you will see we are getting John as a programmer. Same as we can also use the required arguments. So what is required arguments? So if we don't provide any default value, right? So in this case, if we call any function, so these 2 variables are required by this function because there is no default value is provided. When we call this function, it is mandatory to provide these 2 variables in argument. So if we don't call this function with 2 arguments, it will go and complain about it. So if we just go and run this, you will see an error. We are getting an error. So it's saying missing 1 required positional arguments, which is employee role for this particular line number 28 here, right? So if I just quickly go and comment this particular lines and run the code again, you will see now we are not getting any error because we are providing 2 arguments which is expected, which are required, right? So required arguments are the mandatory arguments of the function. These arguments value must be passed during function call. So there is another type which is called keyword arguments. So the keyword arguments are mentioned during the function call. So when we call that function, we have to provide the keyword arguments like key and values format. For example, if I go and provide directly employee name equals to John and employee role equals to programmer. If we go and run this code, you will see now this function is get executed. So the important thing is, so it is not mandatory to provide arguments in order. I can also do something like this. Right? So the order doesn't matter. So first I'm providing the argument employee role, and second I'm providing that name. So this order will not matter. If I go and run this code, you will still get the same output, right? So this is keyword argument. So now let's go and see the variable arguments. So in Python, we can also use the variable arguments if we want to pass multiple arguments. In advance, you don't know how many arguments you are going to provide to a function, right? So this is very useful when we do not know the exact number of arguments that will be passed to a function, or we can have a designed where any number of arguments can be passed based on the requirements. I will write a complete new function for that. So I'm defining a function called func, and here I'm providing numbers, right? We are using a for loop for number in numbers, just printing number. let's say calling func with single argument. Now let's call that function with value 77. Now let's call the same function multiple args. Now if this time I'm calling that function with 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, for example. Alright. Now let's quickly go and trace that code to understand it better. Now let me just provide some more information, like now let's go and execute one by one. So this is our function which is defined, and here that function is get created inside the memory. Now what we are doing, we are just printing a simple statement. So that statement is get printed. Now here we are just calling a func method. So as soon as we call this function, you will see a new stack frame is get created inside the memory. Execute this statement and see it. It will go and create the tuple inside the memory, and this variable will get reference to the tuple object. Now if you go and execute the next line, so here we are come for that for loop statement, right? Iterated through this particular tuple, and now number is get assigned by 77, the first value, and we are just printing it. So here you can see we have printed that number. Since there is no element left in this tuple, this for loop will get terminated, and here we are just finished with this function calling. And now we are calling the same function with these 5 different arguments. Now let's go and call this function. So here you can see the new tuple is get created inside the memory, which contains 10, 20, 30, 40 and 50. And we are just going to iterate through this tuple one by one, and we will print all the values, right? So here you can see all the values get printed. Go and execute. The first time we'll get 10, it will go and print 10. The next iteration we are going to get 20, so we'll print 20 over here. Now in third iteration we are getting 30, and so on and so forth. If we simply go here and print this, we are getting the same output which we are getting over here, right? So in this video we have talked about the basic thing about the functions in Python, and we have also talked about what are the number of arguments which we can use with our functions, right? So these were some basic concept which is very important for the Python beginners. So that's it from this video, and I hope you liked it. If you do, so don't forget to subscribe, like and share with your friends, and I will see you in the next video. Until then, bye bye and take care.